Hey everyone, welcome to another video about Shakespeare. Finally, we've wrapped up A Midsummer Night's Dream, we've wrapped up the easy stuff. It's finally time, and how exciting it is to move on to something a little more serious, a little more famous, a little more rigorous as well. And what better way to begin than with arguably Shakespeare's most famous play of all time, Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is such a impactful and incredibly influential play that it's hard to imagine the entire history of Western romance and the entire history of that genre in particular, even tragedies, without the existence of Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's been adapted literally an uncountable number of times to some of the most popular works of comedy, some of the most popular films. Think about musicals like West Side Story, which is basically a modern reinterpretation of Shakespeare. Think about really famous films like the one by Baz Luhrmann, Romeo plus Juliet, which became, worldwide successful. It is, like I said just then, almost impossible to conceive of a literary environment or any kind of, modern world almost without the impact of Romeo and Juliet. It has introduced a whole bunch of tropes that I don't think any other play had introduced at that point, and it is something that is a cultural touchstone. So when we say touchstone, we mean something that is literally so central and influential on the world that it is a touchstone, right? It's a stone that everyone has to touch in order to do anything, okay? Think about the dozens and dozens of years of romantic poetry that we've seen. Think about just the incredible amount of content that we've seen in all sorts of artistic mediums, okay? Romeo and Juliet is, by any stretch of the imagination, one of the most important works of literature of all time. Now, having said that, I think some of you might feel a little bit disappointed when you actually go ahead and read Romeo and Juliet, because in my opinion, while it is a good play, it is not among Shakespeare's most clever. In fact, it is a rather simple play by all accounts. It is not something that is, incredibly philosophically complex like Hamlet is or King Lear is, which we're going to get to in time. It's also not something as confronting and as shocking as Macbeth or Titus Andronicus. It is just a play. It is a very, very effective tragedy, and it is a very, very well-written tragedy. That is all there is to it. And I think because it has such a strong romantic element with such a compelling premise and hook, that's what makes this particular work so influential and so important to so many people worldwide. Now, before we start, I think it's worth mentioning a few things about Romeo and Juliet in order to introduce the play a little bit and have you go into it without not knowing anything at all. The first thing to say is Romeo and Juliet is meant to be very melodramatic. It is not a realistic play. In fact, I'd say very few plays of Shakespeare's are meant to be capturing any kind of realism. Okay, so when you read Romeo and Juliet and you meet these characters, right, especially people like Mercutio and people like that, when you meet those particular characters, you're not really meant to take them seriously and on face value, okay? You are meant to take it as kind of almost in good jest at times, which seems a little bit strange considering this is, at the end of the day, a tragic play. But you're not meant to take it particularly seriously. Everything has been exaggerated and blown out. All the emotions are not subtle, they're not soft, they are the most extreme versions of themselves, okay? Any emotion like, love, love becomes so extreme in Romeo and Juliet that, as we'll find out, the lovers are willing to die for each other. Hatred becomes literal murder and killing and war, okay? Envy, jealousy, all these things are completely overblown, blown out. It's like looking at a picture where the saturation has been turned up. Everything just jumps at you, and it's incredibly obvious and unrealistic in that sense. But that's kind of the point of most of Shakespeare's plays. It is meant to be a very intense, experience. And that's what I think you should expect as you're going into Romeo and Juliet. Not something that is, particularly realistic, not something that will, have a very, very logical storyline where characters make rational decisions. Of course not. Okay, one of the play's biggest criticisms, and something that is memed a lot on the internet, is all the plot holes supposedly that Romeo and Juliet has. Why didn't Romeo do this? Why didn't Juliet do that in order to save the day and not have this massive tragedy? Well, in my response to that is, that's kind of not the point, okay? Shakespeare is not writing a play that is meant to be rigorously studied for all the plot holes. There can be no plot holes. Everything has to make perfect sense. It's not a scientific text. Okay, as we've expressed in previous Shakespeare discussions, Shakespeare is a humanist, okay? He's not interested in things like science and logic and rational reason, okay? That's not what his, space of expertise is. He wants to refocus our attention to human emotions, to feelings, to things that we experience subjectively, not this, logic, cold, calculated numbers and reason. That's not what he's interested in. So, as you go into Romeo and Juliet, expect something that is a little bit out there and a little bit funny at times, or a little bit almost absurd, okay? There are certainly moments, especially during the party scenes, where you're going to laugh out loud because of almost how silly some of the lines of dialogue are. But that's just how it is. Shakespeare is intending to create that kind of effect. A couple more things to say. First of all, it is a comment on class separation. And I think that is something that we've discussed in previous, so I don't really want to, re-mention a lot of the ideas, because of course this play is written around the same time as Merchant of Venice, very, very close to the end of the 16th century. So any of the context that we've already discussed for Merchant of Venice, things about the Enlightenment, okay, things about like Shakespeare being a humanist and responding, all that sort of stuff that applies there also applies here, okay? So all those ideas about how, Reformation and the constant changing of monarchs and religions and the chaos and things like that, all that is still relevant. But I think what this play does particularly well, in a similar way to how Merchant of Venice, really portrays society's clash of races and clash of religions, Romeo and Juliet portrays the clash of class incredibly well. Now, when we talk about class, we mean basically socioeconomic status. And obviously class in the modern day is something that is not quite as exaggerated or as obvious as we would like to see. That's because in our day, there is a very, very large middle class that extends all the way from people who really aren't making that much money to people who have a lot of money. And they all kind of look the same. That's the middle class. And we have to remember that in Shakespeare's time, which is a monarchist, a feudalist system, okay, there was no real, there was one class separation, which is you're either filthy rich and part of the aristocracy, or you were basically a merchant, or even worse, like a peasant, okay? Just a regular guy who spent his life, not really engaging in many public affairs, carrying on his very small businesses, doing agriculture, things like that. There was very, very clear distinctions between who was part of that, cream of the crop aristocracy and everyone else, okay? It was so incredibly obvious that Romeo and Juliet almost makes it comedy. It almost satirizes it to an extreme degree. Why? Because we have two families who differ very much in class, who differ very much in the way they see the world, okay? Because class, back in Shakespeare's day, was such a significant division that depending on what class you were in, you had a very, very different perspective on how the world worked. You had a very different take on things. You had a different way of talking and approaching situations, okay? As we'll see, we have the Capulets on one side, okay? And then we have Romeo's family on the other side, the Montagues, okay? And they have incredibly different ways of approaching conflict, okay? They have incredibly different views upon the world, what it means to love, who it's okay to love. These conflicts come head to head through the characters of Romeo and Juliet, because unfortunately, this is a tale of two lovers who are across this class boundary, this class separation, who unfortunately fall in love with each other, okay? So once again, this really draws out the distinctions between the two classes, because now you have two people from these opposite classes who are forced to basically be interacting throughout the entire play. Romeo and Juliet. And then what happens? Well, we see all the internal conflicts, okay? We see all the extreme hatred. We see all the, almost extreme, ridiculous degrees that these families war against each other too. In fact, that's almost the concluding message of the play, right? What good is all this war between classes if it leads to tragedy? So what is Shakespeare really trying to say? Or what is Shakespeare his goal in this play? Well, I would suggest that at least from one level, from a historical standpoint, is to criticize how extremely separate class divisions were and how oppositional they were against each other. That's one of his main purposes in Romeo and Juliet, is to expose the kind of destructive potential that warring, that opposition, that conflict would have in ways that you don't expect, okay? Sure, the classes might fight against each other, and that might mean, the people who are poorer, they get poorer. But he says, no, this kind of conflict doesn't even affect that. It affects something much deeper. It can affect who we love. It can affect what we believe in. It can affect our values, our principles. And Shakespeare, who is a humanist, once again, who believes on returning, thinking about our subjective feelings, emotions, respecting every human as they are, okay? Shakespeare seems to have quite a big problem with dividing people by their wealth and not basically by nothing. So that might be one of the points that you might want to explore as you read Romeo and Juliet. But obviously there are other things that become more obvious, okay? So obviously the star-crossed lovers is almost a completely cheesy through-the-roof trope that we really don't want to think about anymore in the modern day, because it is so completely overdone. These, lovers who fates align, they just happen to meet at the right point. Ooh, their eyes meet and then suddenly they're in love with each other and they're completely inseparable. Like, this sort of stuff is so corny to us now that we can barely feel any of it. But once again, this is kind of where it originates from. The whole idea of love being fatal, love being dangerous even, okay? Who you love being an important part, an important decision, because it might lead to tragedy. All these are ideas about love that Shakespeare explores. Now, once again, love is relevant in some of Shakespeare's work, and obviously he wrote so many love sonnets, he definitely had some thoughts on the matter, but once again, it's not necessarily one of Shakespeare's most complex issues. For example, when we start dealing with the ideas of identity later in the play, or in other plays where it becomes more obvious, like Hamlet, we'll see that Shakespeare has much more conflicted thoughts. But here, his presentation of love seems quite simple. He seems to say that love is this kind of ultimate divine good. Yeah, it is this, magical thing that brings people together that is amazing. But at the same time, it has destructive potential. And you need to be careful about its potential, and that's what you get, okay? Because it has the potential of doing good, but it also has the potential of maybe changing, completely twisting your life around in ways that you don't expect. As well as there's some other common themes that often pop up in Shakespeare's plays. You'll see some appearances in reality. That's something that's very obvious, right? There's an entire act almost in Romeo and Juliet, which is about deception, where people put on masks at a ball, at one of those, I forget what it's called, I think maybe it's a mask ball, an anonymous kind of ball that they used to do. It's a weird thing, we don't do it anymore, but that whole act is about deception, okay? How we can view things as one thing, but then it actually becomes another. It actually underneath reveals something else that is more true than what we see. And Shakespeare kind of attaches that idea to love as well. When we fall in love with someone, do we fall in love with their appearance, or do we fall in love with something else? That theme also comes up a lot, as well as in other Shakespeare plays. So ultimately, what makes Romeo and Juliet so successful and so famous is that it almost represents the amalgamation of all of Shakespeare's most famous and iconic ideas and themes. Stuff like fate, the influence of fate, things like, love and the danger of love and the expression and power of love, appearances and reality, class conflicts, these high separations, these massive tensions between characters that don't belong together, and massive and incredibly well-written soliloquies. Romeo and Juliet has by far some of the best monologues and speeches that Shakespeare has ever written. So really, you can kind of see it like a greatest hits of Shakespeare. And he certainly feels that way, and it certainly has that kind of impact on our current society. So, really excited for you guys to start reading Romeo and Juliet, and really excited to see what you think. See you next time as we dive straight into Act 1 and break it down a little bit. Alright, see you.